there's a stage almost nobody talks about when they discuss rare personality types. A final stage, one that doesn't get romanticized the way Old Soul or Deep Thinker does, because it looks from the outside like isolation, like failure, like something went wrong. But if you understand the actual architecture of the rarest personality type, you'll realize that having very few or even no close friends isn't a sign that something broke along the way. For a specific kind of person, it's the natural final endpoint of a lifetime of increasingly precise selectivity. And today we're going to explain exactly why. Let's start with a distinction that almost never gets made clearly in typical personality content. There's a difference between loneliness and solitude, and the entire premise of this episode depends on understanding that difference before anything else makes sense. Loneliness is the painful experience of wanting connection and not having it. Solitude is the deliberate, often deeply satisfying experience of being alone by genuine choice, having already had connection, and having consciously decided that most of what's currently available no longer meets an internal bar that's grown too specific, too demanding, too refined over years of experience to settle for anything less. The rarest personality types, the ones defined by intense introspection, deep values-based processing, and an almost obsessive need for authentic rather than surface-level connection, tend to follow a very particular trajectory over the course of a life. And understanding this trajectory explains why having no friends so often shows up as a late-stage development rather than an early failure. In the first stage, usually spanning childhood through the 20s, this type of person tends to have a reasonably wide, if somewhat unsatisfying, social circle. They're capable of connection, capable of friendship, capable of showing up in groups and functioning socially, but there's an early, persistent sense of something slightly off, a nagging feeling that most of these relationships are operating on a surface level that never quite satisfies the deeper need for real understanding that this type carries constantly, often without fully realizing how unusual that need actually is compared to the people around them. In the second stage, usually unfolding through the late 20s and 30s, something starts to shift, and it's a shift almost every person with this personality architecture reports experiencing, often with a mixture of relief and grief. The tolerance for small talk, for superficial socializing, for relationships that exist mostly out of habit or convenience rather than genuine resonance, begins to erode rapidly. This isn't coldness setting in. It's precision setting in. Having spent years watching countless surface-level connections, this type starts to develop an almost involuntary radar for exactly which interactions are going to be worth the emotional and cognitive investment required to sustain them, and which ones are simply going to consume energy without ever producing the depth this type actually needs from connection to feel nourished by it at all. This is the stage where friend groups often start to quietly shrink, not through dramatic falling outs, but through a slow, natural attrition, fewer invitations accepted, fewer efforts made to maintain relationships that were never providing real reciprocal depth in the first place, more energy redirected toward the handful of connections that actually do meet the bar. From the outside, this can look like withdrawal, even like something concerning. From the inside, it feels like finally, for the first time, being honest about what actually nourishes you, rather than continuing to perform social participation out of obligation or fear of judgment. The third and final stage, the one this episode is actually about, tends to arrive later, sometimes in the late 30s, sometimes not until middle age or beyond, and it's the stage where the social circle narrows so completely that, from an outside perspective, it can look like this person has simply ended up alone. But here's the crucial distinction that explains everything. This isn't the same isolation that happens to someone who never learned to connect, or who was rejected repeatedly, or who withdrew out of untreated depression or unresolved trauma. This is the endpoint of an entirely different process. A lifetime spent refining an internal standard for what actually constitutes worthwhile connection, until that standard became so precise that almost nothing in the ordinary social world meets it anymore. Not because the person became incapable of connection, but because they became incapable of settling for anything less than the real thing. Let's talk about what's actually happening internally during this final stage, because understanding the mechanism explains why it doesn't function the way most people assume isolation functions. A person at this stage has usually developed an unusually accurate, almost automatic ability to detect the difference between genuine depth and performed depth within the first few real conversations with someone new. They can sense, often within minutes, whether a person is capable of the kind of honest, unguarded, intellectually and emotionally rigorous connection this type actually craves, or whether the relationship is going to remain permanently confined to a surface-level exchange of pleasantries, shared activities, and polite mutual accommodation. This detection isn't arrogance, and it isn't misanthropy, even though it can look that way to people who've never experienced anything like it themselves. It's simply the natural result of having spent decades collecting data on what real connection actually requires, and having become, through that accumulated experience, unable to unknow the difference once it's been clearly seen. Once you've tasted a handful of genuinely deep, fully honest relationships, the kind where you can say anything, be fully seen, encounter real intellectual and emotional friction without either person needing to perform politeness to smooth it over, going back to relationships that exist mostly out of convenience or habit starts to feel, quite literally, unbearable, in a way it never did before that comparison existed. Here's what almost nobody explains about this final stage, and it's the piece that actually reframes the entire experience from tragic to something closer to earned. The fewer relationships this type maintains, the deeper and more genuinely nourishing the remaining ones tend to become, precisely because all the energy that used to be distributed thinly across a wide network of acquaintances now concentrates entirely on the small number of people who actually meet the bar. This is why so many people at this final stage report something that sounds almost paradoxical, having fewer friends than they've ever had in their life, while simultaneously feeling more genuinely connected, more deeply understood, and less lonely than they did during the years when their social calendar was full. This is also exactly why this stage gets so badly misunderstood by people observing it from the outside, particularly family members or old friends from earlier stages who watched the social circle shrink over the years and interpreted it as something going wrong rather than something finally, quietly, resolving into its most authentic shape. You used to have so many friends. Don't you get lonely? You should get out more, meet new people. These comments, however well-intentioned, usually come from people who are still operating within stage 1 or 2 of this trajectory themselves, measuring social health by quantity, by visible activity, by the volume of relationships maintained, metrics that simply stop applying once someone has genuinely arrived at a place where quality has become the only measure that matters at all. There's an important caveat here, though, one that has to be named honestly rather than skipped past in favor of a purely inspiring message. This final stage is genuinely healthy only when it's the result of authentic refinement rather than avoidance. There's a real difference between someone who has arrived at deep, selective solitude because they've actually done the work of forming and sustaining a small number of genuinely deep relationships, and someone who has simply stopped trying entirely, using the language of high standards or rare personality type to avoid the real vulnerability required to build any connection at all. The first version is earned depth. The second is isolation wearing the costume of selectivity, and it's important for anyone recognizing themselves in this episode to be honest with themselves about which version actually describes their own situation. This is exactly why the final stage of this personality architecture isn't measured by the literal absence of people in someone's life, but by the presence or absence of at least a small number of relationships that actually meet the deep exacting standard this type has spent a lifetime refining. Someone with 0 close friends, but 2 or 3 profoundly deep, mutually honest relationships that get regularly nurtured has arrived at the healthy version of this stage. Someone with 0 close friends and 0 ongoing effort to build or maintain any depth at all, hiding behind the language of rarity and high standards, has simply stopped trying, and mistaking that stagnation for evolution is one of the more common and more costly errors this type can make. And this is exactly where we're headed in the second half of this conversation. How to actually tell the difference between earned solitude and disguised avoidance in your own life. What it actually takes to sustain the small number of deep relationships that make this final stage genuinely nourishing rather than genuinely isolating, and why, paradoxically, the people who reach this stage will often become far better, far more present friends to the handful of people they do let in than they ever were during the years when their social circle was wide but shallow. Let's talk about how to actually tell the difference, because this distinction matters enormously, and getting it wrong in either direction carries a real cost. Mistaking avoidance for evolution keeps someone stuck, alone, and increasingly convinced that their isolation is a sign of depth rather than a sign of unaddressed fear. But mistaking genuine earned solitude for a problem that needs fixing can push someone back into exhausting, superficial socializing they've already correctly outgrown, undoing years of hard-won clarity about what actually nourishes them. Here's the first honest test. Ask yourself whether you're actively nurturing the few deep relationships you do have, or whether "I only need a few close friends" has quietly become a story you tell yourself while doing nothing with anyone at all. Earned solitude still requires effort, reaching out first sometimes, showing up during someone else's hard moments, initiating the occasional deep conversation rather than waiting passively for someone else to. Someone in the healthy version of this stage might have a small circle, but that circle is alive, tended, actually receiving their time and attention. Someone in disguised avoidance often has a small circle that exists mostly in memory or intention, people they'd technically call close friends, but haven't actually spoken to meaningfully in months, with no real effort being made in either direction to change that. The second honest test. Notice how you feel after the rare moments of genuine connection actually happen. If you leave a deep conversation with one of your few close people feeling nourished, energized, glad it happened, wanting more of exactly that, this is a strong sign you're in the healthy version of the stage. If, instead, you notice a persistent anxiety even around your closest people, a tendency to cancel plans with the very few relationships you claim to value, a relief when connection gets postponed rather than a sense of loss, this is often a sign that what's actually happening is a broader avoidance of vulnerability itself, dressed up in the language of selectivity rather than a genuine, well-tended preference for depth over breadth. The third honest test, and this one requires real self-honesty. Ask yourself whether you'd actually be open to a new person meeting your bar if they somehow did, or whether the bar itself has become so impossibly high, so perpetually unmet by design, that it's functioning less as a genuine standard and more as a permanent excuse never to be vulnerable with anyone new again. Genuine selectivity is demanding, but it's not impossible. The healthy version of this stage still occasionally, rarely, welcomes in a new person who genuinely meets the standard, even if that happens only once every several years. Disguised avoidance often has a standard so absolute, so unreachable in practice, that it functions less like a filter and more like a wall, guaranteeing that connection never has to be risked again, regardless of who shows up. Now, assuming this is the healthy version, assuming you've actually arrived at genuine earned solitude with a small number of deep relationships you're actively nurturing, let's talk about what it actually takes to sustain those relationships well, because depth doesn't maintain itself just because it was real once. The first requirement is consistency, even when it's inconvenient. Deep relationships at this stage tend to be geographically scattered, often maintained across distance, time zones, different life stages, which means they require deliberate effort in a way that shallow proximity-based friendships from earlier stages never did. This means actually scheduling time with these people, rather than waiting for spontaneous convenience, actually reaching out during their hard moments, even when it would be easier to assume they're fine, actually prioritizing these few relationships during busy seasons, rather than letting them quietly slide to the bottom of the list, the way it's easy to do with something that isn't demanding your attention through regular low-stakes proximity. The second requirement is tolerating friction without immediately retreating into isolation. This is one of the more counterintuitive truths about deep relationships at this stage. Because they're built on real honesty rather than polite accommodation, they will inevitably produce more actual conflict than the surface-level friendships of earlier stages ever did. Not because the relationship is worse, but because real people, being genuinely honest with each other, will disagree, misunderstand, occasionally hurt each other in ways that polite surface-level relationships simply never risk in the first place. The temptation for someone at this stage is to interpret any friction in one of these precious few relationships as evidence that even this one doesn't meet the bar after all, and to quietly withdraw rather than working through the disagreement the way genuine intimacy actually requires. Sustaining this stage well means learning to stay through the friction rather than treating every disagreement as proof the relationship was never as deep as it seemed. The third requirement, and maybe the most important, continuing to risk new connection occasionally, even after you've found your small circle, rather than treating your existing depth as permanently sufficient and closing the door on ever finding more of it. Life changes, people move, grow apart, sometimes pass away. A person who has built their entire emotional world around 2 or 3 irreplaceable relationships without ever risking the vulnerability of forming new ones can find themselves in a genuinely precarious position later in life if any of those relationships end, for any reason, and there's no remaining capacity, no remaining practice left for building depth with anyone new. Staying occasionally open, even from within a place of real contentment with your existing circle, is what keeps this final stage sustainable across an entire lifetime, rather than leaving someone dangerously dependent on a small number of people who, being human, won't all be permanently available forever. I want to say something important here because I think it's the piece that reframes this entire episode away from something that could sound isolating or even a little sad into something that's actually closer to a quiet kind of triumph. Arriving at this final stage, done well, isn't the story of someone who couldn't keep friends. It's the story of someone who finally, after years of performing connection that never actually satisfied the depth they needed, learned to stop settling, and who discovered on the other side of that refusal to settle, relationships more honest, more sustaining, and more genuinely nourishing than the crowded, superficial social life they left behind ever managed to provide. I want to leave you with an image because I think it says everything this episode has been circling around. Picture an orchard planted decades ago, spread wide across a large stretch of land, full of dozens of young trees, all planted close together, all competing for the same limited water, the same limited sunlight, the same limited soil. In the early years, this looks abundant. So much green, so much visible growth, so much activity across the whole field. But look closer, and you'll notice something the density was always hiding. None of these trees, planted so close together, competing so constantly for the same limited resources, are actually able to grow to their full intended height. They stay stunted, crowded, each one just barely surviving off whatever scraps of nutrients and light manage to reach it through all the competition. Now picture years later, someone finally thinning that orchard, removing tree after tree, not out of cruelty, not because those trees were somehow worthless, but because the land could never support all of them at their full potential simultaneously. What's left, after the thinning, looks sparse by comparison. Fewer trees, more visible space between them. To someone who remembers the earlier crowded field, this might look like loss, like decline, like something went wrong. But give it time, and something remarkable happens to the handful of trees that remain. Freed from the constant competition, finally given access to the full share of water, sunlight, and soil that used to be split thin across dozens of stunted neighbors, they grow taller, deeper rooted, more fully realized than any tree in that original crowded orchard ever could have become. Their branches spread wide, uncontested. Their roots go deep, unobstructed. What looks, from a distance, like an empty field is actually the site of the only real growth that was ever going to be possible. Growth that the crowded, abundant-looking orchard was quietly preventing the entire time, just by existing in such density that no single tree could ever get what it actually needed to become fully itself. This is what the final stage of this personality type actually is. Not a field left empty by failure. A field finally thinned enough for a small handful of things to grow the way they were always meant to. Deep, wide, fully rooted, exactly as they should have been the entire time, if only the crowd had ever given them room.